Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for being here for the second time listening to me. I will be very short. And before I came to this conference, I prepared a few thoughts for this morning's session. And then, of course, given the discussions we had yesterday and the day before, I decided to throw that away and instead come with a few ideas that I thought would be perhaps particularly useful. And before I do that, in fact, the first issue I wanted to raise here is an update on the status of ratification. Many of you may have heard, but we have moved forward from the numbers that I gave you 2 days ago. Yesterday in New York, we had quite a few countries, 31 in particular, that came forward and deposited their instruments of ratification. So we now have 60 countries and 48% of emissions. So one of the triggers of the double trigger is done. And we have 7% to go. That's not little, but it's not a lot, and I'm very confident that we will actually reach the numbers we need for entry into force sometime at the end of this year or very early next year. So this is because we also had, in addition to depositing instruments, a number of countries came and actually informed the people who were there, the Secretary General, about their intention to ratify before the end of the year. So we're in good shape there. So that's good. The second issue I wanted to come back to is the small island countries, and we had some discussion of that yesterday, but also the day before. And I just wanted to reiterate the incredibly important role these countries played in the last few years in actually making sure that we have a temperature goal, whatever that number is. They were the ones who pushed for the 2 degrees to start with. They were the ones who pushed for the 1.5 degrees. And this has been, they've paid a lot of political capital to achieve this, and I think we need to recognize that. They were supported by the least developed countries, by the EU, absolutely, very important, but their role cannot be underscored. And in that context, I think this was some of the discussion also yesterday, it's really important that the assessments that you're doing about the meaning, the implications of the 1.5 degrees and of the 2 degrees and the differences between those will particularly address the small island countries. They need to know. They have asked for it. They have asked for it already in Copenhagen very clearly and before in Bali. So please make sure that in your work you address that in whether it's feeding into the special report on 1.5 or any other forum. So let's not forget the small island countries. The third one, now that we have fixed the entry into force, well, I hope we did, I think we can actually concentrate on the real implementation of the Paris Agreement, which is about what countries will actually do to reduce their emissions, to adapt to climate change, to provide financial resources, etc., etc. And that, of course, is done through their national climate plans, the NDCs, and hopefully very much connected with and in synergy with the Sustainable Development Goals, as we discussed also yesterday. Now, in the discussions yesterday, I heard quite a few interesting messages that I'd just like to run through a few of them that together give us a certain picture. When I came here to this conference, I assumed that I would be hearing that we have already gone beyond 1.5. And in fact, what I heard is that we're at 1, so that's good news. Maybe not for very long, but it's still good news. It gives us a little bit of room for maneuver. Then we heard a lot of interesting ideas, and I think we'll hear some more about mitigation options. And there are some really good opportunities out there, and which I hope will be engaged. And of course, in the short term, I think we know clearly the technologies that we have, and there are a lot of potentials there. But in the longer term, I think it's very clear that in order to reach those goals and maintain those goals, we need nothing less than a revolution, not just in terms of new technologies, but also social organization, the way we make use of those technologies. And that, of course, it will be partly driven by the research and innovation that you will be engaged in the coming years. Now, we've also heard very interestingly that there are many options that are not particularly labeled as climate change actions, but development actions that we need to undertake in order to reach some of those goals. And we must remember that. We also heard some very different views on so-called negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal, like BECS in particular. And sometimes I wonder if BECS is not just a simple fudge factor to make sure that our global models come to zero when we run them or balanced, or whether it's really a serious set of technologies that will actually start coming online and will actually start making a difference when we need them. We also heard some interesting numbers about overshoot, going beyond the 1.5 and 2, and to do that for short periods of a few decades, which in my books is a generation at least, and how we deal with that in terms of adaptation before, during, and after. So there are sort of mixed messages coming out of here. Can we or can we not reach the 1.5, even the 2, and to what extent the 1.5 is going to be more difficult? And that brings me to my fourth point, which is we sort of have the tendency, especially in the formal process, to sort of think of the ideal and plan for that. We have 188 INDCs presented in Paris, fantastic. And if they will all be implemented 100%, then we're going to get 2.7 to 3.5 degrees, which is not as good as we want, but it's not bad and we'll be fine. But this requires 100% implementation. And for that, we need a perfect world. And I don't think we live in a very perfect world these days. If you look around the geopolitics, it's pretty messy. And when the politics gets very messy, then the leaders and their ministers are very busy trying to solve those geopolitical problems instead of focusing on the issues of sustainable development and climate change. But even more practically, if you look at, we've talked about it in the United States, one of the candidates would like to take the country out of the Paris Agreement. In the Philippines, the president has already said that he plans to take the country out of the Paris Agreement. These are signals that are not good, and they're not helpful for the implementation. Now, I'm an optimistic person, and I'm sure that we can do it. But at the same time, I'm realistic, and if we're sort of responsible managers of our planet, I think we have to plan seriously for a range of scenarios and manage the risks of those different scenarios, not just the ideal, the perfect, when we will implement everything 100%. So, and that brings me to my last point. So does 1.5, actually even the 2 degrees, but certainly the 1.5, does it automatically imply that we need to make use of geoengineering options? And this is an issue that came up yesterday. It came up also on the first day in the plenary. And I think my answer at this point is very clearly that we can't actually answer this question because we don't know enough. Because at the end of the day, we will need all options, all the different options we have to manage our climate, which include, of course, mitigation, which include, of course, adaptation, which includes financing of different options, and it includes a whole range of what we generally refer to as sustainable development actions, perhaps not directly climate, but indirectly definitely helping the climate. It requires all of that. And then maybe, yes, we will need some additional tools. But in order for us to be able to understand the viability of geoengineering, particularly solar radiation management tools, compared to these other options, we need to find out a lot more, because we just simply don't have the information to make that intelligent judgment today. And I think this is particularly true when it comes to some of the governance requirements of these options, which are, to say the least, they're out of the ordinary. They might require governance frameworks that we have not yet thought about or developed, and it may actually be that it is the governance option itself that may be the most limiting factor in their eventual use. So I think we need to do some further work on that before we are able to answer that question, and this is precisely what the Carnegie Council will try to do where I work now, to try to address that in the next few years, try to have a better understanding of these governance frameworks that we will require if ever we consider seriously making use of these technologies. And we will try to do that by bringing this up in different fora, particularly in the intergovernmental policy fora, to try to have a better understanding of what is needed so that we can then eventually make proper decisions on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we have 5 minutes for questions to Janos. So please. Any questions? Yes, David Keith.
Simple question. What do you mean by geoengineering?
I did say that particularly solar radiation management, there's a big debate about what we should or should not include in geoengineering, and I personally, I have not worked through completely that topic, whether we should just simply talk about solar radiation management and exclude some of the other techniques that are generally labeled as CDR, but it is an issue, and I totally understand why one should focus on solar radiation management and leave the CDR out as kind of advanced mitigation options. So this is a debate that has to take place, and certainly in our project we will address that, and we will try to come to some conclusion, but we have not yet.
Yes, I think it would be practical for the discussions to separate SRM and CDR, so we are clear about what we're talking about. Next question, I think it was over there, and then Øyvind. Short questions.
Yes, if I understand you correctly, you say that we don't have enough information to judge about geoengineering technologies and including solar radiation management now, but I fear that this is a little bit like 30 years ago for climate change. Don't we have enough scientific information to say that this is dangerous and that we should not try something dangerous unless we have really tried everything else?
Well, I did say that the focus has to be for Paris on the mitigation, on the reduction of emissions. That's what we have to do. But I don't think we're in a situation where we can exclude any of the options that might help us one day. I don't think we know enough in a serious way to say that, for example, so let's just focus on solar radiation management, that it will definitely be so bad compared to the world that we will have in a few years, which may make us decide to go there if some of these mitigation options don't succeed the way we want to. I don't think we're in a position to say that today in a clear way. We need to have some more information for that to happen. I am not, our project is clearly not promoting geoengineering, but it is promoting a better and cleaner dialogue about those issues, so we understand what the potential positive and negative impacts may be.
Next question, and then short questions, please.
Thank you for your talk. The question is, what would you say about the need and change in the messaging to the general public and to investors in particular in order to ensure the shift towards the new paradigm and towards the actual implementation so that it is efficient?
Well, the messaging now is about meeting the very immediate goals of reducing emissions. That's what we have to do. That's where we need to focus the public. That's where, and that's also to adapt to the changes that are already there, that are already visible. Those are the two things that we must do, and that's where we need to engage the public. I think we need to engage the public also in the dialogue about other options like geoengineering, but that's at a very different stage. And without public involvement, it's not going to be a true discussion. But I don't think there is any, we are ready to have this kind of massive public messaging about geoengineering today.
Hi, I'm Tobias Schultz with SCS Global Services, and I had more of a comment. I just appreciated what you were saying about how we shouldn't plan around the ideal. My company's a third-party certification body, so sort of our living is saying things how they are and if things aren't working. And frankly, I think you're absolutely right. A lot of the models are using kind of CCS and BECCS as a fudge factor. It seems really hard to believe that somehow in 20 years we're going to have billions of tons of CO2 being stored. I mean, that being the sole focus of many of the discussions about mitigation here has been something I was like to see be a lot more broadened to include projects, not just like radiation management, but also things like black carbon abatement and ozone abatement, and more of a focus on other of the non-CO2 gases. So I think I really appreciate your comment of just saying we shouldn't plan around this ideal that CCS is going to prove viable, because the reality is it may not prove commercially viable, and we need to look at the whole portfolio of options that can get there.
Last question, Eileen Kristoffersen, 2 rows further back.
Thank you. It's more comment. I think that quite often when geoengineering is mentioned, it creates a very unstructured debate, and that's because geoengineering is not really a very good term because it contains so many different things. It contains like bio-CCS, also forest projects, biochar, fertilization of the ocean, and solar radiation, and so on. So it's and some of these have more governance framework and guidelines, and some have not, and they are so different. So I think we should try to avoid to use this broad term and talk about, you know, bio-CCS, fertilization, and other options as separate options. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I think we have to move on to the next speaker, which is Elmar Kriegler. Please, Elmar.